I'm making up for lost time, and I'll be on tonight as they tell me. I'm following instructions, and also tomorrow morning. So it is a kind of a mixed-up schedule, and so you'll have to bear up with me tonight and tomorrow morning. That is to make up the time that we lost in flight. Things are a little mixed up this way, and it reminds me of the florist that Norman Elliott told me about, who sent out 2 bouquets of flowers, one to a businessman who was going to establish a business in a new locality. And they thought it would be very appropriate to send a beautiful bouquet of flowers out there for the occasion. And he was also to send a bouquet of flowers to a mortuary. Well, he got a little mixed up, and a phone rang a few minutes later, and the businessman said, "Say, what do you mean sending me out a bouquet of flowers?" And it says, "May you rest in peace." And he said, "I don't want to rest in peace. I'm a businessman. I'm raring to go in this new location." And so the florist said, "Oh, I goofed." And he called the mortuary, and he said, "Say, I sent you a bouquet of flowers." "Yes." "Then now where did you put that bouquet of flowers?" He said, "Right next to the casket." "What does it say?" "Congratulations on your new location." Which isn't so bad. Believe it or not, I'm wearing Norman Elliott's shirt. He didn't want it anymore. He didn't know what to do with it, so he gave it to me. Well, Norm and I are the very best of friends. There's nothing I wouldn't do for him, and there's nothing he wouldn't do for me, and that's what we've been doing for each other all through the years, nothing. Reminds me of the story that Starr Daily, and I just received a wonderful letter from him just last week, told about during his youth on his escapades and so forth. He wanted to stay overnight one place, and so he went into a mortuary and crawled into a coffin. Which reminds me, do you know what one casket said to another? "That you coffin?" No. But anyway, these things just come, I'm sorry. Isn't it awful? And he was in this coffin taking a night's rest, and the custodian came, the caretaker came by to, see that things are all right and turn on the lights and everything. And Starr heard him come in, and so he sat up in the coffin and looked at him, and the caretaker took one look at him, whoa! And Starr Daily said, "I still don't know what happened to him. He's probably still running." But that reminded the time of when my son Glenn was working for a mortuary in Beloit, and he called me. It was about 9:30. I just got home from a meeting. My nightlife is terrific in the ministry, as you know. And I just got home, and the phone rang, and Glenn said, "Dad, will you come down to the mortuary and help me close up tonight?" Well, I said, "Well, yes, Glenn. Is it kind of spooky down there?" "Yeah, sure is, Dad." So I said, "Well, sure." And I went down there, and I was running around. We were kind of hurried because we wanted to do something else later. And I ran around the corner, turned out the lights, and almost fell into a coffin on top of a fellow. And I said, "Pardon me." Now, if he said that's perfectly all right, I went, "Woof." I would have had troubles too. Well, this, in a way, introduces us to our subject. Oh, by the way, I'll speak a little slower tonight. This morning I was just off the plane and I was still flying high. And I guess I spoke a little too rapidly and probably ran some words together, and you didn't understand them all, which maybe was fortunate for you. But anyway, I'll speak with more deliberation tonight. We're thinking upon a subject which is important to every one of us, whether we are young or old, because young people have tremendous tensions and problems, just as older people do. We're thinking together this evening on relax and live. It's that important. As politicians say, America is strong and vital, vigorous and dynamic, standing serenely confident before the rest of the cookie world. Last year, we as Americans gobbled down more than 600 tons of tranquilizers. Now think of that. Tranquilizers, 600 tons. A distraught woman entered a doctor's office not too long ago, and she sat tense and nervous, waiting to see him. And when he came to see her, as she stepped into the office, she said to him, "Doctor, I'm all run down." After he examined her, he said, "No, you're not all run down. You're all wound up. Why don't you relax and live?" said a minister to a businessman who came to see him in his office one summer day. The man was in a state of nervous tension and exhaustion, and the minister was also speaking to himself as he asked the question, for he saw himself in this man a few years ago. "Relax," countered the man. "I wish to heaven I could. I'm all wound up like a spring. But the way competition in business is nowadays, I can't afford to let up." The minister quietly said, "You cannot afford not to let up. Otherwise, they're going to say you were a good man, but you didn't last long." Now, this man was a casualty of our step lively, don't block the traffic civilization. Our get results culture leaves us nervously, frankly, physically, and spiritually exhausted. And I'm speaking always to myself, as you know. Hurry is a peculiar American disease, so much so that it's been called the name Americanitis. Americanitis. We're always hurry, 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 tense, on the go. And for a whole generation, we have been keyed up, literally traveling on our nerves. A man running up an escalator, that is too often the picture of America. And when we were at O'Hara Field, I saw these men running up an escalator. And you wonder, sort of a sad commentary on our age. In fact, Dr. Harold Wolff, past president of the American Neurological Association and professor of neurology at Cornell Medical College, said most of all of our physical and mental illnesses are caused by tension. Overwhelming evidence has been gathered during 30 years of studies to show that nearly all diseases involve the nervous system. And Dr. George Cryle said 75% of illness in America is due to nervous tension. So I think we need to consider the subject, relax, and really live. Enrico Caruso had a dinner table trick which he used to delight in executing for the pleasure of his fellow diners. He would hold a very fragile glass aloft on by its narrow stem between his thumb and his forefinger, and he would sing an ascending scale until he'd reach a certain high note, and sounding that high note repeatedly for a moment, it would cause the glass to shatter into bits. And I am told that the most severe test given to an automobile on the proving ground is to drive the car at a high speed over a smooth concrete pavement. The high frequency vibrations thus set up attack hidden parts in the mechanism much more rapidly and with greater damage than on a rough road. Now, if tension can so profoundly disturb the mechanism of metal construction, how damaging must its effect be upon the mind and the nerve cells and the hearts of the mechanism of flesh and blood and personality called man? Well, stress and tension do affect us in many ways. In the Reader's Digest, I don't know if some of you read this particular article, but it fascinated me because it was just along this line in July 1970. Dr. Hans, it's S-E-L-Y-E. I never know how to pronounce it. Some say Cells and some say Sally. I've heard different pronunciations of that name, but we'll say Cells for the sake of convenience. As director of the University of Montreal's Institute of Experimental Medicine and Surgery, and he writes this: under continuous stress or tension, either physical or mental, some vital body part gives way, leading to a variety of illnesses and eventually to death. Early in his career, Dr. Sells subjected rats to a variety of stresses: cold, fatigue, frustration, interesting enough, noise. And a startling fact emerged. No matter what the nature of the stress, the same type of external wreckage resulted. Blood pressure soared. At autopsy, the rats showed gross enlargement of all the important adrenal glands and shrunken thymus and lymphatic glands and peptic ulcers. Could stress be the common denominator for most human illnesses? And the answer is yes. The body's ductless glands, mainly the pituitary and the adrenal glands, strive to maintain an unchanging environment inside the body. Let any threat and stress be applied, and those glands react instantly. The response is exactly the same whether the rat is subject to extreme fatigue or the boss bawls out his secretary. Blood pressure and blood sugar rises. Stomach acid increases. Arteries tighten. Now, before we become too fearful on this matter of stress and the cause of it, and cause more stress and fear, Dr. Sells assures us that all stress is not bad, not at all. Stress can be the very salt of life. We are stressed in a game of tennis, or when, is it Arthur Moore plays horseshoe, or when I'm playing volleyball, setting it up and let the other fellows do the spiking and the blocking, or we see an exciting melodrama. We are in our least stressful state upon awakening in the morning, and we know how some of us feel. Then there's apt to be a little mental confusion and a poor muscular coordination. And sometimes the way I feel in the morning, I'm lucky if I don't clobber someone before breakfast. But Estelle Carver, who spoke at the Wisconsin Camp Farthest Out, a delightful person, 80 years of age, so knowledgeable, just a tremendous person. She met one of the women before breakfast one morning, and she said, "This is the day that the Lord has made. Rejoice and be glad in it." And the woman said, "Oh, not so early in the morning." Well, stress wakes us up and makes us alive, but the difficulty arises when a particular stress, whether mental or physical, is applied for a long period of time. To augment what Dr. Sells said, let me put it this way. There is a place for tension in our lives. That is, the human mind creates under pressure quite often. And often we do our best work when we are driven by necessity. But tension, to be meaningful and creative, has to be temporary. Even a rubber band stretched, that is, perpetually stretched, loses its resilience. To be constantly keyed up, on the move, and I have to watch myself on this, and we all do, pressing on is to cultivate destructive tension. If we never let go, we'll arrive at the point where we are unable to hang on. And speaking of destructive tension and stress, when asked what they were, Dr. Sells replied, hatred, that's interesting, frustration, anxiety. And these are the things that Glenn Clark so often said we have to get out of our minds and spirits to be effective powers of prayer for ourselves and others. Now, these stresses boomerang. After all, it's not the hated person, the one you hate, or the frustrating boss who will get the ulcers and hypertension and heart disease. It's the one who hates. It's the one who permits himself to be frustrated. Thus, love thy neighbor as thyself is a wise bit of medical advice. When Dr. Sells was asked how we can combat fatigue, he replied, well, very few of the tasks we perform produce true fatigue, which results largely from the accumulation of metabolic waste in our overworked muscles. But here's interesting, monotony can produce a reasonable facsimile.
It isn't the energy, in other words, that the housewife expends on her chores that tires her out and produces vague aches and pains. It's the repetitive tasks. It reminds me of the story of Dr. Dahlberg, who was president of the National Council of Churches and World Council of Churches, which he called it this way: too much tingling and ba-ba. Well, that interested me, and I said, what do you mean? He said, well, it comes from a situation in Colorado where there was a law that seems very, very peculiar. It says no sheep herder can work alone for too long a stretch of time. He must be with another person. Well, why would they have such a law? And to answer that question, one must understand that the occupation of a sheep herder is the loneliest in the world. For hours and days at a time, the sheep herder or shepherd must watch his sheep, and for what seems an interminable time, carry on his lonely task without contact with another person. He hears the far-off ting-a-ling and the ba-ba of the sheep, and the silence and the quietude is broken only by that ting-a-ling and a ba-ba. And it was when Colorado discovered that of all the occupations, the insanity rate was the highest among sheep herders, that they passed this law to protect themselves, to have companionship. It was a peculiar hazard of their work. Well, then Dr. Dahlberg told of an incident that happened with a Chinese cook who was hired by some ranchers to prepare food for the men who would go out and care for the sheep. At first, this Chinese cook was very happy with his job, and the men were satisfied with him because he was very fine in the culinary arts, a very fine cook. However, as the days went by, and the men left him all alone, all by himself, between breakfast and supper, and he listened for hours at a time to the far-off ting-a-ling and the ba-ba of the sheep, one day he confronted the foreman. He said, "I quit." And amazed, the foreman said, "Well, Charlie, why? Isn't the pay sufficient?" "Oh, yes, the pay is very good." "Well, isn't the food that we give you to prepare for the men, isn't it of high quality?" "Oh, yes, the food is very good." "Well, what is it, Charlie? Why are you quitting?" And Charlie paused a moment and said, "Too much ting-a-ling and ba-ba." Well, I know exactly what he meant by that. It was bugging him, as our teenagers would say. And there are times when you and I get fed up with everything, if we're honest about it, with our work, our family responsibilities, and life becomes too much ting-a-ling and ba-ba. I remember a story, perhaps you read it in the newspaper a few years ago, of a bus driver in New York City who took the city bus and drove all the way to Florida with it. And a lot of people were sympathetic with him. He'd had it. I can understand in the smog in New York City and all that. He'd had it. And too much tingling and ba-ba. This phrase has become a byword in our family. There are days when I come home utterly exhausted of boys and troubled, and people are in the hospital, and others with marital problems and all kinds of difficulties. And when I get home, I'll flop in a chair and heave a heavy sigh, and Snooky, Helme, my actual pet name, would say to me, "What's the matter, dear?" And I'd say, "Too much ting-a-ling and ba-ba." Well, sometimes we have no conception of how accelerated we become or the speed at which we drive ourselves. And it's perfectly possible for a person to be quiet physically and still live at a high tempo. Even an invalid can live at too high a pace. It's the mind that determines the pace. It goes rushing pell-mell from one thing to another to worry about this, and soon or later we are worn out. Well, the question is, what can we do about these tensions? I think we can begin by eliminating as much as possible environmental aspects of stress and tension. Now, one thing is noise. Sirens screaming, riveting machines pounding away. I remember they were repairing a street outside the church office one day, and the riveting machine was going. First, I didn't notice it, but after it got to me, I was and hardly could do my work, and I realized this noise was getting inside to me. So that some city ordinances are made to eliminate as much noise as possible because they recognize it's a health hazard. And air conditioning commuters are not only good for the comfort, the air condition being cool, but it serves some other purpose. It helps keep the noise outside out and helps people in that way. And then there's the noise of some people who talk too much. I don't know whether I should quit now or not. It's best expressed this way. I love its gentle gurgle. I love its fluent flow. I love to turn my mouth on and love to hear it go. Of course, this is a hazard of a preacher. Douglas Horton put it this way. We are like an old shoe, all worn out but the tongue. Another thing we can do to watch these tensions and stresses and emotional drains, as we said this morning, don't use $1 worth of emotion over a nickel incident. And ask yourself, well, what difference will this make 10 years from now? And you'll be amazed. And you won't get upset so much. And then I think we need a change of pace. And this is due to physical exercise where we can get rid of tension through play. Never get too old to play. In other words, and I speak especially to the men, don't get hooked on your job. Don't be a work addict. Never get too old to play. It's important. I remember playing volleyball down at the YMCA, and I was talking to a man next to me, and I said, well, you really enjoy this game, don't you? And he said, oh, I sure do. I've been playing it 40 years. And I said, what? Say that again. I've been playing it 40 years. I said, how old are you? 75. And he was a very fine volleyball player. But he said the doctors told him always constant to keep at it. Moderation, not overdo it. Keep your muscle tone fine and high. After a funeral service for a man of 55, the widow remarked, Jim was all business, but he never learned to play. Well, probably Jim felt too important to play. The office needed him constantly on a job. But you know something? The office is carrying on very nicely now. He wasn't as indispensable as he thought, and as he is now in the rest area in heaven for tired businessmen. Creative play is very important. But here I think we have to be alert to the fact that we must not work at play. Sometimes men at golf try to get such a low score that they work at it. And it causes almost more tension. It'd be better if they never played golf at all. They can take it too seriously. Like the man who was playing golf, and a funeral procession went by, and he took off his hat. And his partner said, well, funeral processions have gone by before, and you never took off your hat for a funeral procession? Well, he said, my wife, you know. I think he took that game a little too seriously. It's good for us to have a hobby, and I'm preaching to myself again. We all needed to use our hands in some way, and it's better to sing Sweet Adeline off-key than to listen to the best TV program you can possibly listen to. And this is good in our CFO rhythms and so forth, and the relaxations and the play and the joy that we receive, and swimming and walking under the stars in quietness is a great help. To pray under the stars is to say with the psalmist, he restoreth my soul. Starr Daily called it, and I love this phrase, redemptive loafing. Redemptive loafing. You see, when we have adequate play, adequate food, adequate rest, adequate peace of mind, our bodies are healthful. But somehow we have a guilty feeling, and I have to watch myself at this, and so do all of us, that somehow if we're not busy, we should be busy at something. And sometime when I have a little time off, just to have redemptive loafing or just sit around like Starr Daily, redemptive loafing, you feel, well, no, you should be doing something. This is the disease, I think, of our age. I remember a newspaper reporter went to see a very prominent doctor, a specialist, and he wanted to get an interview with this man. And while he was out in the waiting room, as the doctor was seeing certain patients, this newspaper reporter just marveled at the capacity of this physician to do all the things he had to do with such ease that would naturally be too much for the ordinary man. Well, during the interview that he had later with this physician, he found the secret. He was sitting on the edge of his chair getting all tensed up, ready to take down this interview with this outstanding physician, and the doctor looked at him and said, "Man, relax, man, relax. If I carried your tension that you have now through the day, I just couldn't last a day. I have a secret. After a certain amount of time, and I feel a little tension, I go back into the inner office, and I have a nice, comfortable chair, and I'm not disturbed for 10 minutes. I've learned to let go and utterly relax. And then I can come back and do 10 men's work." Now that reporter left with not only a good story, but a great lesson in life. I know a very fine business executive in St. Louis who does the same thing. When things begin to pile up, he'll call the outer secretary and say, "Now for 10 minutes, I'm not to be disturbed at all." And then he'll take out the Bible and read passages of peace. And he'll read about the peace that passes all understanding and about Jesus. And he'll look at a beautiful plant and think of the Creator working through that plant and working through him, relaxing him to let go and let God. And this is the secret of that man's ability to get a great job done effectively. Another way to ease tension is to limit some of our activities. You know, half of our activities simply drain off our energies, leaving us no wiser or better, just busy. Someone put the biography of such a person in this amusing poem, and I'll read it to you because it sums it up beautifully. On Monday, she lunched with a housing committee with statistics and stew. She was filled. Then she dashed to a tea on crime in our city and dined with a church ladies' guild. On Tuesday, she went to a babies' week lunch and a tea on good citizenship. At dinner, she talked to the trade union bunch. There wasn't a date she dared to skip. On Wednesday, she managed 2 annual dinners, one at noon and one at night. On Thursday, a luncheon on bootleg sinners and a dinner on war. Is it right? World problems we face was her Friday noon date, a luncheon address, as you guessed. And she wielded a fork while a man from New York spoke that evening on social unrest. On Saturday noon, she fell into a swoon, missed a talk on the youth of the land. Poor thing, she was through. She never came to, but died with a spoon in her hand. I think we need to ask ourselves whether we are spending our energies profitably or just spending them. It's not planned living, but frittered living that creates tension. The pace of living can be guided and be more effective. A wise man always discovers that the way to make haste is to make it slowly. This is as an old veteran coach whose university crew won many a race on the Hudson River. He used to say, "Boys, if you want to row fast or go fast and win the race, you must learn to row slowly." He pointed out that rapid, choppy rowing tends to break the stroke. And he said you probably would not get back into the rhythm and the other crew will sail right by you. To go fast, row slowly. This is a law of life. To row slowly, we must have the peace of God in our mind. And this is the best way to eliminate tension. It's letting go, as Glenn Clark used to say so often, letting go and letting God. And he had to learn the hard way, as you know. In his young manhood, he was told by his physician that he wouldn't live to be 40. And he had this palpitation of the heart, as some of you know. And he was called to Estes Park to be a leader there. And he was afraid to be alone because when this palpitation of the heart seized him, he wanted help. And they thought they were being kind to him, and so they put him in a cabin all by himself. And he said that night, the palpitation of the heart seized him, and it's so difficult to breathe. He didn't know what to do, but he opened the window, and he looked out upon the moon-drenched hills. And these words came to him, unto the hills where I lift up my longing eyes. Oh, whence for me shall my salvation come? From whence arise? From God the Lord, who made heaven and earth has made. And Glenn said, at that moment, I said to God, here I am. I'm your man. Whether in the kingdom of heaven, here or there, I am your man. And he said it was total surrender. And he stepped into the kingdom of God. I think this was the power of Glenn Clark. This total, complete, utter surrender to the Most High. So that he became a channel of God's love and strength and power. And he took quiet times in the morning, would arise early and allow nothing else to interfere with it, like George Washington Carver, that great synthetic chemist. And there in the morning, reading great passages such as, be still and know that I am God. Or as the psalmist said, the Lord will bless his people with peace. The mountains shall bring to the people peace. And as I looked at the hills across Lake Winnipesaukee, I thought of that peace in this universe that God has provided for us. And Romans, Paul saying, now the peace of God be with you. The peace of God that passes all understanding shall keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. In other words, Paul found his peace, the deep inner peace, that made him go through trials and tribulations triumphant because he had this inner peace of God. He found through Jesus, and so can you and I. When life gets too much, we can steal away to Jesus. Which reminds me of many years ago when slavery gripped our land, disgraceful slavery gripped our land. The slaves would gather together in Christian fellowship after the day's drudgery was done. And as a natural part of these religious gatherings, and they were deeply religious, they compared their slave experiences. Some discovered they had harsh masters, and others discovered they had fairly good masters. Some discovered that they had to work excessively hard, and others discovered that they were treated with some consideration. And when such disparity was discovered, a restlessness took place among them. This is characteristic of the religion of Jesus in the midst of injustice, and this is true of any prophetic religion in the midst of inequality or injustice. The Hebrew prophets voiced this through the land. Let justice roll down as a mighty stream, and Isaiah and Jeremiah and Micah and Hosea and the rest protested against any form of degree and tyranny. True prophetic religion, resists injustice in any form. And the greatest prophetic religion of all time, of course, is the religion of Jesus. And so as the slaves grew more restless over their lot, the white masters realized this and forbid to have them have any more religious meetings at all. But this did not stop them in any way. For under the cover of darkness, after a hard day's labor, the slaves would slip away and meet and pray together and worship God and follow the Christ together. And the signal that they would use to tell of the meeting that night lay hidden in their softly singing, steal away to Jesus. From one slave to another, from one plantation to another, this hymn passed swiftly until all were informed of the meeting that night. It was a strange church bell indeed, the singing softly of steal away to Jesus, summoning all to worship the Christ. And in the Christian experience and in the fellowship with Jesus, their lot became easier, and they were better enabled to bear their burdens. Stealing away to Jesus made it possible to stand up in an intolerable situation they could not immediately change. Now, none of us, and to that degree at all, are slaves today as they were, but to some degree, and again I'm speaking to myself, we're all slaves, aren't we? Shackled, bound to worry or fear or anxiety or self-centeredness or the hurried pace of living. But Christ can set us free. We need to take time each day to steal away to Jesus and to have this quiet time to renew our strength, to commune with God, to experience the power and the reality of God. And it makes no difference when we have this quiet time, but where it is important, where we're not disturbed. As Jesus said, go behind a closed door, alone with the Father. What do we do in this quiet time? I think first we want to be assured that we will not be disturbed and that we can worship the Father in secret. We can read great passages of Scripture that tell us of the reality and the power of God. We can contemplate the amazing, expanding universe in which we live. We can do as Dr. John Bunting would often do, have a cross and look through it and see the eternal Christ. We can do it as a great botanist did with a flower, holding in his hand and quoting Tennyson's poem, little flower in the crannied wall, I pluck thee from the cranny. If I could know what you are, root and all in all, I would know what God and man is. Incidentally, this is Dr. George Washington Carver's favorite poem, The Reality of God. Aware of the eternal presence, and then to pray positively. As Dr. Clark said, all cringing and fear and mistrust must vanish in this quiet time so that we can open our hearts to God, so we can put our needs into his hands with perfect confidence and his absolute love, knowing that we can unload our burdens and confess in all honesty at times that we have been unkind, we have been jealous, we have been intolerant, we have been proud and impure, or whatever the case may be, and knowing that God forgives with an outflowing, loving forgiveness, accepts us as we are, thank God, and builds us into the potential person that you and I might be, and then releasing all unto him and letting go and thanking him before the prayer is answered, for the answered prayer. Thus we affirm God's peace and his power and say we are safe within his care. You see, it isn't the prayer that works the miracle. It's the consciousness of mind that the prayer induces. The prayer is the inner attitude of the soul, lifting the mind to the infinite mind of God, which is the secret and the stimulus of the best Christian living. And it accounts for the tribute that someone played to Thomas Chalmers as we close now with this great man. He was a man bustling about in the world's activities, organizing and speaking, and with the dust and the fire of the world upon his clothes, but carrying his shrine with him everywhere, the inner citadel of his soul, so that he could face all the eventualities of life with tranquility and with peace and with power. We too, in the midst of problems and difficulties, can possess this inner citadel of the soul, this inner strength, this inner peace. So come what may, we can be triumphant persons in this life now and forevermore, because we walk in fellowship with the greatest life ever lived, with Christ. And Jesus never hurried, never tense, relaxed in God. He lived and moved and had his being in his heavenly Father. God is perfect peace, and the kingdom of heaven is tranquility and serenity. And Jesus said to you and to me, peace I leave with you, my peace I give unto you. Not as the world giveth, give I unto you. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid. Let us steal away to Jesus as we sing this hymn.